Welcome, everyone. Welcome. And we're good to go. Wonderful. We're off. Welcome, everyone, to this evening's special event with the Wine Society and Brindisa Spanish Foods. My name is Tim Schwalk, and I'm the manager of the Tastings Events team here at the Wine Society. And together with my colleague from the Tastings Events team, Gil Riggins, it is our pleasure to welcome James Edwards and James Robinson from Brindisa and Tim Sykes, the Wine Society's buyer for sherry. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Tim.
Great. So before we get started, we do have a number of members joining their first Wine Society event. So firstly, welcome to those. And just a quick bit of housekeeping so everyone feels comfortable with the proceedings for tonight. If you'd like to ask any questions at any stage, please use the Q&A button. Now note that those questions are only seen by Gil and I, so there is no need to worry about your spelling or grammar. As you type, just punch it out and we'll be able to read it for you. If you'd like to make comments and share opinions on the wine or the hams that we're tasting tonight, please use the chat function, making sure to address your comments to all attendees and all panelists. That is, unless you want to only comment to the panelists, and then you can just address it to all panelists in that case. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can email us on tastings@thewinesociety.com. Although if you're needing to do that, you're probably unable to hear these instructions. Alternatively, the session is being live streamed over on our YouTube channel. So if you are having any difficulties with Zoom, please try there. As for tonight's event, we're going to kick things off with Tim Sykes sharing his insights into the just released 2021 bottling of Tio Pepe's En Rama sherry. We will then pass the microphone over to the two Jameses, who will share a presentation on Jamón before a tasting of 4 different types of Iberico ham. Hopefully all of those of you who have purchased the tasting boxes, and they did sell out, have those ready to go. Then Tim and I will come back on, and together with the two Jameses, we'll discuss the art and science of food and wine pairing. We'll then finish by taking questions from members. So hopefully that sounds like a good night. I'm certainly hungry and ready to get into the hams, but before we do, we will start with the sherry, and in particular, the En Rama style, which Tim, I believe, actually owes its creation to the Wine Society. Could you tell us more?
Well, yes. I mean, not strictly speaking to the Wine Society, but the Wine Society was, I have to say, instrumental in resurrecting it. Good evening, everybody. So I'm the sherry buyer for the Wine Society, which is a fantastic part of my job, which I love because I'm a huge sherry fan. The sherry we're recommending tonight is Tio Pepe's En Rama Fino. Now, just to explain what En Rama means, it basically means raw in Spanish. And my predecessor as buyer of sherry for the Wine Society was Toby Morale. And he went to visit Gonzalez Baez, who make Tio Pepe, and had a long conversation. This is 12 years ago, by the way, and realized that the wine that he was tasting out of cask or out of butt when he went down to Jerez had an awful lot more flavor than the Tio Pepe that he found on the shelves at the local supermarket. And the reason for that is that sherry, these Fino sherries and Manzanillas, which are the lightest weight sherries and the palest of the sherries, and the ones that you need to eat to drink freshest, they tended to be quite, well, they were filtered. And so you didn't get as much flavor when you actually came to taste the wines out of bottle or the sherries out of bottle. So En Rama, raw, simply means you are tasting a sherry with the minimal amount of handling. So it's had very little fining. In fact, I don't think it's had any fining or filtration. So the wine is really like tasting out of cask, or it's as close as you can get. And you don't get quite the same brightness. So you do see sometimes a little bit of cloudiness. I don't really pick up a lot of cloudiness in my little half bottle of the wine that I'm tasting tonight. But the wine is just slightly less stable, should we say. But I think what it lacks in clarity it more than makes up for in flavour. I think it's probably just worth starting with a slide of where we are talking about in Spain. So the sherry region, as you can see from the little tiny map in the top right-hand corner of your screen, that shows you where Jerez is. And then if you drill down to the main map, you can see Jerez, which is the main town of sherry. There are 3 towns effectively in sherry. It's known as the Sherry Triangle. So you can see Jerez there. Northwest of Jerez, you've got Sanlúcar de Barrameda on the Guadalquivir river, and Sanlúcar makes Manzanilla. So it's made in a very similar way to Fino, but if it's aged in Sanlúcar, the wine is called Manzanilla. And there is a slight nuance in the flavor of Manzanilla. You get a slightly more salty tang, and that's apparently the proximity to the river and the sea. And the third corner of the triangle is El Puerto Santa Maria, which you can just see there southwest of Jerez. What we're talking about tonight is a sherry that comes from the vineyards just northwest of the town of Jerez. And if we go on to the next slide, you can see what the countryside looks like and what the soil looks like. There you go. So you can see it's a very, very pale soil. It's called Albariza soil. And that is the best soil for producing Palomino, which is the grape that goes into 95% of sherries. So this is 100% Palomino. And what happens is that when the wine ages, you get this layer of yeast that sits on top of the barrel. There we go. So this is a barrel that's had the end cut off, or each end cut off, and a light put through it, and you can see the perspex end, so that you can see the layer of flaw. This is something that develops. It's a natural yeast, and it's that protects the sherry underneath from oxidizing, and it also imparts this lovely kind of bready, yeasty flavor and aroma to the wine. If you've got a glass of sherry in front of you, do feel free to enjoy. So the sherry layer of flaw is at its thickest in the spring. So to get the En Rama with the maximum amount of flavor and the thickest flaw, the wine is bottled in March or April. This wine, that for those people who've got the 2021 bottling of En Rama, it was bottled this April. And so you have a wine here which is as close as you can get to tasting out of barrel. It was recently bottled. González Baez so started or resurrected the idea of En Rama with Toby Morell 12 years ago. Toby decided that he wanted to import a sherry with the maximum flavor. And it was a bit of a risk at the time because we didn't know how stable or unstable the wine would be. And we were worried, as I think González Baez were, that it would turn up its toes after about 3 months because it hasn't been filtered and is in its rawest state. Thankfully, the wine did last, and we sold pretty much overnight the entire parcel that we bought. I think within 24 hours we sold all of it. And of course, the rest is history. We've bought every single bottling since the original bottling that Toby did with González Baez 12 years ago. So this is the 12th edition. I think it's absolutely delicious, and I cannot wait to try it with all the goodies that I've been sent by Brindisa today. One thing that you'll notice is that I'm actually drinking this wine out of a white wine glass. There is a tendency in this country to drink sherry in rather little glasses where you don't get the full aroma. You really need a glass that you can stick your nose in and drink in literally the aromas. So I would recommend, if you do have kind of slightly tulip-shaped white wine glasses. For me, these are the ideal glass for drinking sherry. Temperature-wise, cold as possible for Fino sherry. I do think that, you know, particularly in summer with the beautiful weather we've been having, it's lovely to have a really lovely chilled bottle or half bottle of sherry, of En Rama or Fino or Manzanilla sherry in your fridge that you can grab at the end of a long day. In terms of the shelf life of this wine, it would not be as long as the normal Tio Pepe, which is, as I mentioned earlier, filtered. So this wine should ideally be drunk within 12 months of it being bottled. So by the end of March next year, if you can bear to hang on to your En Rama that long, you should really drink it. Although I have to say, I have tasted some older bottlings, you know, several years old, and they've still been lovely. So we err on the side of caution and say drink it within around 12 months of bottling. In terms of food matching, obviously we're going to be talking about food matching a little bit more detail. But for me, I have to say almonds, jamón, olives. I love it with sushi. I think Fino and Manzanilla sherry goes brilliantly with sushi. Fish and chips. It's my go-to wine for fish and chips. But most kind of seafoods and fish, it's only 15 or 15.5%. I can't remember if this is 15 or 15. Yeah, it's only 15%. So it's really, you know, it's like it's maybe a degree more than your typical, Aussie Chardonnay or something like that. So it's not exactly, you know, a heavyweight wine, but it's all about the temperature of the wine and the lovely nuanced flavors that you get with particularly with an En Rama, which just has so much character. I think it's a terrific wine. Later on in tonight's webinar, I will be recommending other sherries that you can drink with it, but we'll stick with that for the moment. So enjoy the ham presentation and enjoy tasting along with the different hams that the guys from Brindisa will be presenting to us.
Tim, just before we jump over to the two Jameses, a question about this particular En Rama being a little bit lighter than potentially other En Ramas. Is that something that a winemaker can control, or is it really due to the level of floor?
No, it just depends on the level of floor. So I think we've got a slide. I really ought to show the slide of the master blender, Antonio Flores. He's been working at González Baez for years. He's I don't speak a lot of Spanish, and he doesn't speak a lot of English. There we go. So I took that picture when I last visited, which was in October 19. He is this passionate and brilliant blender, and he's the cellar master at González Baez. And so he put together this particular blend, which was of 82, I believe, different butts or barrels. You have very little control over the color. Some years it's got more color. It's got less color this year, you're right. But I think the climatic conditions of the winter, where the floor starts to develop, has a bearing on the color and indeed the flavor profile of the wine. And the great thing is it's different every year. And that's what makes it so fascinating.
And just one more question, then we'll come back for more sherry questions at the end. But how old is the Solera? And could you possibly explain what the Solera system is, just quickly?
I don't know how old the Solera is, but I guess it must be very, very old indeed, because Tio Pepe has been offered on the market for many, many, many years. It's I think the best-selling Fino in Spain. But let me just take another gulp.
Any excuse.
The Solera system, very briefly, it's a way of aging sherry. It's known as a fractional way of aging sherry. So when you see pictures of barrels in bodegas in sherry country, you get different layers of barrels. And basically the youngest sherry is in the top layer, or criadera, and the oldest average age sherry is in the bottom one. So what happens is that when you bottle your sherry, you're bottling from the lowest level of the barrels. You take away, I think it's up to a third of the wine that's in those barrels, and then you blend it together and bottle it. And then what you do is you take a third of the row above the barrels and transfer it into the bottom row. And what happens is that there you go, you can see there are 3 levels there, or 4 levels, the 4 levels there, in fact. The wine that's moved into the lower level takes on the character of the remaining wine in the lowest level. And you do the same to the next level up and the next level up. So it's a way of aging the wine relatively quickly, but also maintaining the style of the wine in the bottom row. And that's what it's all about. And obviously Gonzalez Baez do it extremely successfully.
So that's why the label, when the wine, it's referred to as a 2021 bottling. It's not that the wine has come from the 2021 vintage. It's
correct. Absolutely right. I can't remember what the average age is of this wine, but I think it's around 6 years off the top of my head, but I'm probably talking rubbish. I can't remember.
That's right. So please do keep submitting your questions. We will come back and answer more questions and group as many as we possibly can to get through as many as we can. But I think we've had a drink. It's now time for a bite to eat. So can I welcome James and James? We've got James Edwards and James Robinson from Brindisa. One James now.
In fact, James Edwards is off preparing his carving, so he will return shortly. Good evening, everyone. We're going to do a presentation on both Iberico ham and, before that, something of the life and the environment in which the Iberico pig is raised, because this is a fundamental part of what makes it such a remarkable product. So we will first of all look at its environment, its background, its ancestry, and then move on to the actual production of the Iberico ham. So let us share the screen. James, here we go. No, apologies. Takes a bit. James is my technical man. I am a dullard when it comes to these technical things. So, Spain and ham. Those of you who have travelled to Spain will know that ham is everywhere in Spain. In bars, in shops, in supermarkets, everywhere you will see hams on the bone hanging around. And this is indicative of the Spanish relationship with pork in general. The Spanish are the largest consumers of cured pork products in the world. And they produce, as you can see there, 55 to 60 million hams every year, the majority of which are consumed domestically. It seems strange, sometimes one sees it quite a lot now in British retailers, and one feels that they must be exporting quite a lot, but it's still something like 75% of production is consumed domestically. So really, ham is something that the Spanish love and have been producing for a long time. And this is a very important part of it, particularly when looking at Iberico ham, because tradition and the knowledge that's been handed down over the years from master ham curer to master ham curer is really crucial when it comes to producing a good ham. There isn't really a guidebook that you can read, that says, right, you do this for 3 days at this temperature, you do this then for 10 days. It is much more based on an understanding of what is occurring to the ham during the course of the processing, of the production of a ham. Now, Spain is unusual, almost unique, certainly in Western Europe, in having two different distinct varieties of pigs. First of all, you have your white pig there on the left-hand side. And the white pig essentially is of Celtic ancestry. And these are the white pigs that we know as domesticated animals. There are lots of different breeds: Landrace, Jersey, large white, Gloucester, Old Spot, whatever. There are many of these, but essentially they are domesticated animals. The Iberico pig, on the other hand, is a semi-wild animal that is unique to Spain. And this is the great advantage that the Spanish had in producing something that is unique and desirable. It is really the ancestry of this animal is what makes it such a special thing. So what is it? It is essentially, fundamentally, a cross between a domesticated white pig and the Mediterranean wild boar. This occurred, however, over 3,000 years ago. The Phoenicians, who are a trading nation from the Eastern Mediterranean, over the course of 1,000 years, colonized most of the Mediterranean basin, both north and south. And they settled in Spain in what is now called Cadiz. At the time, it was the Phoenicians called it Gadia. And this is where they set up their first colony. Now, being experienced colonists moving to unknown lands, they knew that it was wise to bring food with them, food on the hoof. So they brought livestock, they brought domesticated pigs, which had not previously been seen in Spain, in order to provide them with food over the winter, before they got to know what was available in the region. Nature then took its course. Wild boars managed to get in amongst these domesticated animals and did what wild animals or more domesticated animals will do, and produced progeny. And the progeny is essentially what the Iberico pig is: a crossbreed between a domesticated animal and a Mediterranean wild boar. The reason this is so important is it is the genetic ancestry from the wild boar that enables the Iberico pig to live outdoors all year round in the southwest of Spain. You're looking here at a region where the temperature can be in the mid to high 30s in summer and can get down to just about below zero in winter. So you have a wide temperature range, which most pigs cannot survive in. So this hardiness that they've inherited from their wild ancestors is fundamental to the life of the Iberico pig. All this takes place, this slide I wanted to introduce. In essence, what this shows is the physiological differences between the white pig and the Iberico pig and what it says about their ancestry. On the left there, you have the white pig ham. It's quite short, it's got a huge round ham, a short hock, and in my more fanciful moments, I think it looks mildly similar to a banjo, perhaps. On the right, you have the Iberico ham, and as you can see, it's much longer, it's more slender, and this is evidence of the way in which it needs to use this leg. The domesticated animals are essentially designed and have been bred to live in confined or enclosed conditions. Simplistically, they don't actually really need their legs, particularly nowadays when there's more intensive rearing of white pigs. Literally, they will spend their entire life in a stall. And therefore, their leg has no particular function other than being the place on which the muscle grows, which will produce the meat for the ham. The Iberico pig, on the other hand, as you can see, it has this long, slender leg, particularly the upper part from the hock down to sort of midway down the ham. And this is because this is an animal that lives outdoors. It's required to negotiate the vegetation, the briars, the brambles, all the kinds of things that one finds in natural grasslands. So what you can see is that the shape of the animals has been defined by the activity of the animals. You have the enclosed white pig, which has a short leg because it doesn't need to use it. The Iberico pig, on the other hand, for the last 3,000 years, has been continuing to roam outdoors and therefore requires this long, slender leg in order to negotiate around the land in which it lives. And the land in which it lives is called generally the Dehesa. The Dehesa is a region in southwest of Spain, of the Iberian Peninsula. I do apologize. Working for a company that imports Spanish food, we do have a terrible tendency to forget that the Portuguese exist on the Iberian Peninsula. But the Dehesa is a savanna-like system in the southwest of Spain and in the east of Portugal. Broadly, a savanna is a wooded grassland. The image that you can see there is a fairly typical example of a fairly heavily wooded Dehesa. The number of trees on it will vary greatly from about 20 up to 150. And the density of trees per hectare will decide how many animals can be fattened up in a particular region. This Dehesa is something that has evolved like the animals that live there over thousands of years. It is essentially made up of three layers. You have your grass layer, on which the animals will feed, will live. You have a shrub layer in between, which is a mixture of desirable things like herbs, which the animals will feed on, which will have an effect on the final taste of the finished product, but also includes shrubs, bushes, briars, the undesirable aspects. These are things that will throttle trees, that will prevent the growth of grass. So this is undesirable. And then you have the tree layer. And the tree layer is the single most important part of this ecosystem. Their roles are multiple. The really important ones are that they provide shade and they break up the wind. Two things which prevent the possible desertification of the region. It doesn't have thick, rich soils. So were the trees to have been cut down, they would have been quickly baked by the sun. And then in a region of quite strong winds, the topsoil could easily have been lifted off, leaving nothing but a desert. This was figured out really quite early on in man's development of the region. And they discovered that they had to create a sort of low intensity form of agriculture in order to maintain the health of the ecosystem. So they have what's called an agro-silvopastoral system, a combination of all kinds of outputs. The agricultural side is essentially the growing of a small amount of crops designed to feed the human inhabitants and the animals which were being kept alive over the winter. They would also grow quite a lot of legumes in order to put nitrogen back into the soil. You then have the silviculture, which, as I said, is the maintenance of the trees. One of the things that's interesting about the Dehesa is that the image you can see, which looks like, you know, a bucolic idyll, is in fact the result of man's intervention over 3,000 years. Every single tree you can see is required to be pruned every 15 to 20 years on what is classified as Dehesa. So it's a bit like a Capability Brown landscape. It's designed to look very, very natural, but in actual fact has been managed by man to become this way. It's essentially actually the thinning out of the primal forest that was there when the Phoenicians arrived. The trees obviously provide, as I said, they provide shelter to cool the overall environment. They break up the wind. They provide shade for the animals that are there in the summer. They provided charcoal, and charcoal, very effective means of cooking. And also, obviously, cork is a fundamental product produced in this region. So the trees have numerous functions in this dehesa. And then you have the pastoral, the keeping of animals. And it's not just about the Iberico pigs. You also have indigenous breeds of cow, goats, sheep. The sheep are merino. They used to be the source of the wealth of the Spanish Empire before the wool trade dropped off. But these animals continue to live there. They provide wool, they provide milk, they provide meat, they provide cheese, and likewise with the cows and also the goats that live in the region, the indigenous breeds down there. The goats also help out. They're the ones that are released in the spring so that they will be consuming the early growing shrubs, briars, the undesirable kinds of growth that you're looking to get rid of. So it's done in a very natural way. So you have this very balanced, low intensity ecosystem that has been developing like this for thousands of years. And this again gives the continuity and the background to the animals that live on it, particularly, as I said, the Iberico pig. The region itself is, as you can see there, the area shaded in dark green. And this is, it covers from Castilla y León in the north, down through Extremadura, west and east across Andalusia, and then also in the Alentejo region of Portugal. And this really is what makes this such a fundamentally Spanish product. You will find crossbred animals, pigs, from where domesticated animals and wild animals have mated all over Europe, whether it's Italy or Germany or Austria or France. It is only Spain that has the area, the size, to actually commercialize this product. As you can see there, it's big. Depending on how you calculate it or what you describe as the dehesa, it's between 3 and 5 million hectares. And when you consider that Belgium is about 5 million hectares, you can see that this is an enormous area in which the animal has evolved over the past 3,000 years. Now we're going to look at the life and the production of the highest quality of Iberico hams. We'll look at the different grades subsequently, but at the moment we're going to look at the Jamón de Bellota, the acorn-fed ham, which is the true glory of Spanish gastronomy. As I mentioned, most of the trees on the dehesa are oak trees, and for a period of around 4.5 to 5 months, these oak trees are producing fruit, acorns. And these are what are going to be used to fatten the Iberico pigs fortunate enough to have been chosen to become bellota animals during the autumn and winter down on the dehesa. The reason that there is such a long fruiting period is that a variety of oak trees are used. It's not a single species. The most desirable, the best known, the most oil-rich acorns come from the evergreen oak, the Encina. And this is where you will get the sweetest hams. This, if you give the pigs a choice of the acorns from the different types of trees, they will instinctively go first for the Encina acorns because they are the sweetest and the oiliest and the most appealing to them. But along with them, you have the cork oak, the Alcornoque, and you also have the Portuguese or quejigo, which grows quite widely. Encina is the main, the dominant species of tree, though, on the dehesa. Now, when one talks about the fattening of pigs and the eating of acorns, I think a lot of people imagine that the animals are in the farm and that a truckload of acorns turns up, empties it into the troughs, and the animals feed on that. But no, the animals will actually forage for the acorns. And again, it's a fundamental part of what will go on to create this remarkable finished product. So the only human intervention in the animal fattening really is the swineherd, the porquero. It's not a job description, I think, that would get many takers in the UK, but in Spain, it is still a very important job. The porquero will go with the herds of pigs when they're out on the dehesa. And as they're consuming the acorns from a particular tree, he will use that instrument you can see him holding, essentially a long wooden staff with a leather strap beater on the end. And he will use these to knock the acorns out from the upper parts of the tree in order to essentially clear all the acorns off the tree. Subsequent to that, the animals will move on to the next tree, repeat the process, knock down the acorns, eat them, move on to the next. The result of which is that the animals may walk up to about 15 kilometers a day. And this, again, is really important. It helps the fat interleave into the muscle. This activity will help the interleaving of fat into the muscle. And also, well-exercised protein tends to have a much better flavor than that from inactive animals. So, the pigs are out on the dehesa, they're fattening up. They will have arrived at the beginning of the Montanera weighing around 90 to 100 kilos, the slender and rather elegant beast you can see on the left. And 10 to 12 weeks later, they will have put on 50, 60% of their body weight, having eaten essentially only acorns. The animals are eating 7, 8 kilos of acorns every day. And as a result, they're putting on approximately 1 kilo of body weight per day. This is something that if you actually consider how much you had to eat, you're probably not a long way from 90 to 100 kilos yourself. To put on 1 kilo of body weight a day would take a huge amount of work. And it's fortunate that it is the acorns that really appeal to the pigs. So the pigs are happy to gorge themselves. Their natural instinct is to fatten up before the winter months or during the winter months in order to provide energy for the future leaner months ahead. And the result is this huge growth of fat on the body of the animal, rich, oleic acid rich acorn oil. So in 10 to 12 weeks, these animals will, as I said, put on more than 50% of their body weight before they go off to the slaughter. So now we're going to look at actually how you make a ham, an air-cured ham. In essence, it's quite a simple process. Broadly, there are 4 stages to it. And the first one, and most crucial one, is the salting. Now, this is done almost exclusively with sea salt. And in essence, the old-fashioned method, which is still quite widely used by many producers, is to build a wall of pig's legs. So you lay down the layer of salt, you put down a layer of raw legs on top, cover that with salt legs, salt legs, salt legs, as you can see there, till you've got something that's sort of 1.5 meters high, sitting there in a cold, humid chamber, beginning to absorb the salt. And of course, it is this salt that is going to allow it to become a long-cured product. The salt has numerous functions, but the most important are that the absorption of the salt into the pig's leg creates a saline environment which most harmful or spoilage bacteria cannot survive in. So immediately you've cut down the risk of rotting, a rotting ham. They also begin the process of dehydration through osmosis. They pull the water out of the cell wall without rupturing it and replace it with this brine, again creating a safe environment without the harmful kinds of bacteria. They will also begin to affect the shape of the actual appearance of the internal face of the ham, the muscles. It unnips the proteins and readjusts them, setting them into a different alignment, which is why you change from a sort of pale, translucent meat to an opaque, dark red meat that is the finished ham. Another reason, obviously, is that humans have evolved to need and enjoy salt. And therefore, this salting is going to give those savory flavors that we all crave. It will spend about 1 day per kilo of leg weight in the salt. Again, I talked earlier about the lack of specific guidelines for how you cure a ham, and this is one of them. Things will depend on the size of the ham, how well they've been trimmed, as to how long they go in the salt. And the ham master will be keeping a close eye on it and deciding when they have had sufficient. Given a normal ham, the initial weight is likely to be somewhere between sort of 13 and 15 kilos. They will spend that number of days in the salt. At the end of which time, they are taken out of the salt. They're washed down gently with warm water to remove any external salt, because they've now absorbed enough salt for the process to be able to be completed. And they go to a resting phase called the asentamiento. And here they will sit in cold, humid conditions. The temperature will be 1-2 degrees, humidity up at around 90%. And they will sit here for a period of 2 to 3 months, during which time the salt will gradually penetrate all the way through to the bone. One of the things that interested me when I first discovered the humidity and the temperature, I was rather surprised. I thought, they're making an air-cured ham. It seems slightly counterintuitive to begin it in this humidity in particular. The reason is the last thing you need is for a crust to form on the exterior of the ham. If you do that, then the water that remains inside the ham will not be able to get out, and you will get a rotten ham. So it's very important that the humidity, external and internal, are more or less similar, in order that water can move from the ham and increase the pace of the drying. During this time, they will lose about 15-17% of the initial weight. So it's a very important stage where the drying process really does begin. Before they're being moved out to the next stage, the temperature's raised, the humidity's dropped, and then they are moved on to the next phase. This is the secadero. Now, the secadero, the drying part of the process, is still carried out by most producers in ambient conditions, and it will give it a certain individuality and character, because the climate of any particular curing house will have its unique characteristics. So they're generally put on the top floor of curing houses. And the way in which the speed of the curing is speeded up or slowed down is very, very old-fashioned. In essence, each of the drying rooms is surrounded by windows which are covered with louvered shutters. And they use these louvered shutters, these louvers, to adjust the amount of airflow that is coming through the room. So, for instance, if you've had a warm spring and the hams have been coming along faster than you think desirable, and then a westerly wind comes in carrying moisture from the Atlantic, you will open those westerly louvers in order that the moister, damper air can spread around through the hams, slowing down the drying, curing process. On the other hand, if it's been damp and cold and the hams are behind with where you want them to be, and the warmer winds are coming up from the south, from Africa, the Sahara, coming up from there, they will use those to help speed up the drying. again, it goes back to this thing of knowledge and experience is what is important. They will have maybe been doing this for 20, 30, 40 years, their parents, their grandparents perhaps, and this accumulated knowledge is what guides the movement of these hams rather, as I said, than any strict system of doing so. This then, in the ambient drying chamber, in the secadero, the hams will follow the changes in the temperatures of the seasons. So if you think they'll be coming in the spring, they'll probably be going there from about January onwards. As I said, there's this 5-month period during which the animals can be fattened. And as the spring progresses, summer comes along, the temperature's going up to the mid-30s, and the hams begin to sweat. The fat, both external and internal, begins to move around in the ham. So acorn oil, oleic acid, will melt generally at around 23 degrees. So if you have a temperature that's up at 35 degrees, the fat becomes basically liquid. Internally, this means that it moves through the muscle, which will result, when you come to eat the ham at the end, in this rich, sweet fat being everywhere. And therefore, one of the reasons why when you first put a piece of Iberico ham into your mouth, you get an immediate explosion of flavor, because the fat is there transmitting all those notes. Externally, they sweat, and the fat runs from the outside of the hams and drips onto the floor. And I have to say, I'm visiting a secadero in summer in Guijuelo a few years ago. I was in a room probably with about that number of hams. It was hot, all the shutters were closed. The only sound you could hear was the fat dripping off these 5,000 hams, and the aroma coming off that molten fat in this enclosed space with 5,000 hams sweating away was one of the most intense sensory experiences I've ever had. It's really remarkable. Then, as the summer finishes, it turns to autumn again, it cools down, the fat, the hams tighten up, the meat tightens up again, holding that fat in place, and the hams become ready for the fourth and final stage of production, the bodega phase. Now, at this point, the ham has lost around 32% of its original starting weight. Most of the drying has been done. And what goes on in the bodega essentially is chemistry. This is where the enzymes in the meat begin to break down the proteins and the fats, creating complex aromatic molecules, which are released and then recombined to create further complexity in the flavors and aromas. And over the course of a minimum of 1 year, but with some producers, they will take it for a further 2 years or even a further 3 years. That is what is going on. You have the complexity and the intensity building due to the length of the cure. How do you know when it's ready? Well, it, again, as with most things I've been saying about the Iberico ham, is a very simple, old-fashioned technique. Using something called a calla, which you can see there on the bottom left-hand side, it's a sharpened piece of bone, generally from a horse or a cow, which the ham master will use to penetrate the ham in 3 different places. It's not dissimilar to when you're roasting your chicken, finding out whether it's done by putting your skewer into the deepest part of the ham. But rather than looking for clear juices, what you are looking for, or the ham master is looking for, are the aromas that he is getting from the meat right in the center of the ham. And a good ham master, an experienced ham master, it is said, can identify up to 200 different aromas within the overall smell of the ham. This is something that you probably, masters of wine would probably be quite good at this, identifying those different aspects of it. I would have to say I probably would be able to identify 15, maybe 20 on a good day. But it is the real skill of this is being able to sniff that piece of bone and know what state the ham is in, whether it's ready to go out, and even what the quality of that ham is going to be. So there is the ham. Once he has smelt the aromas, is satisfied with them, the ham is ready to be dispatched. Now, before we finish this, I think a really important part of any discussion about Iberico ham is recognizing what it is you're looking at or tasting. And this has been rationalized, possibly simplified in 2014 by government decree because of the confusion that had been arising. When the animals are slaughtered, just after slaughter, a regional vet will apply a tag to the hock of the animal, and it will be one of 4 colors. The one at the top, the black label, the precinto, is indicative that this is the very top grade of Iberico ham, the Jamón de Bellota 100% Iberico. This is the only ham that should be described as a pata negra. So it is de Bellota, means it has fattened on acorns on the Montanera. 100% Iberico means it's a purebred animal. And as I said, pata negra, the black foot, is simply a designation now supposed to be only used for purebred animals. You then have a second grade with a red tag, Jamón de Bellota, 50%, 70%, 75% Iberico. This is an animal with either one parent or one grandparent of white pig descent, specifically the Duroc breed, which is the only one that can be crossbred with Iberico animals. So that is a very good ham, Jamón de Bellota. It's fattened up on the acorns, but it has been crossbred in order perhaps to create an animal which will grow a little bigger, perhaps have an extra litter or a piglet or 2 in the litter. But it can be a really, really excellent ham. The third grade with the green label is the Jamón de Cebo de Campo. And this can be 75%, 50, or even 100% Iberico. And what this is an animal that has lived the same life, basically, as the acorn-fattened animals up until the point of the Montanera. The Cebo de Campo animal is actually then fattened up on grain to get to the required weight. It may get to consume a few acorns if there's some left over after the Montanera. But broadly, it's a grain-fed animal, but it is also free range. It has lived the same life on the dehesa as the acorn-fattened hams. Where it gets really confusing is this last grade with the white label, the Jamón de Cebo. This again can be 75%, 50%, or even 100% Iberico. But what is most important is that it is not an outdoor reared animal. Whereas the acorn fattened animals are required to have a minimum of 1 hectare per animal during the fattening period. The Jamón de Cebo is required to have a minimum of 2 square meters. So immediately you can see this is probably an intensively reared animal. It can eat concentrated feed. It doesn't have to be produced in the southwest of Spain. So this is a pig that really is not part of the same evolution, the same continuity of the past 3,000 years, unlike the previous 3 grades. The real issue with this, however, is that the Jamón de Bellota purebred makes up about 10% of all Iberico hams. The crossbred acorn-fed ham makes up about 10% of all Iberico hams. And the free-range Jamón de Cebo de Campo makes up about 20%, which means 60% of Iberico hams are probably intensively reared, generally by larger industrial concerns, because it can be sold at a premium as Iberico ham. but it doesn't have the costs of the production of the other forms of ham. So if you're in Spain and you're offered a choice of hams and one of them is a lot cheaper than the other, it doesn't mean you're getting a much better deal. It means that this was a pig that was reared intensively and has very little connection with the dehesa. And for me, that really isn't the point. The story of this 3,000-year evolution, the ecosystem of the dehesa, the balance, the low intensity, these are the things that I think make this such a wonderful type of ham. And that is something that the jamón de cebo does not have. So when you're buying, look out for this, be aware of what it means, and then make your choice. Thank you very much. Oh. Are you muted, Tom?
Yes. So
Not any longer.
I believe now the other James is going to show a bit of carving, but and you may need to turn your camera off, James. But I've got a couple of questions. So would you be able to answer a few questions whilst we get that set up?
We're going to taste together and then do a quick thing, if that's all right. I don't let James do the tasting by himself because it's the best bit.
But if you've got a few questions we could answer now, then it's a good point to do it.
Sure. No, we'll get into the tasting, but just one quick one. Is there any difference between the hind legs and the forelegs? Or
Yes.
are all legs the same?
Only the hind leg is the ham. That describes the hind leg. The front leg is known as a paleta or shoulder. They are also cured in the same way as hams are, but for a shorter period. And whilst the meat, some people feel the meat can be even better because it's got more fat and it can have the richer, sweeter notes. Because of the nature of the bone structure of a shoulder, they're difficult to carve and therefore not particularly popular. And they make a very good value entry level if you want to buy a purebred acorn fattened animal. The shoulder is a good place to start.
Sure. And another question was, what happens to the rest of the carcass?
All used. Smaller muscles get minced up to be combined with fat to make charcuterie. Some of the individual muscles are butchered and sold to restaurants now. There are cuts such as pluma, presa, secreto, which are butchered off. The loins are removed and cured, and the plentiful acorn fat is rendered down and then used. You can either use it in kitchens for perhaps making croquetas with a bechamel with the Iberico fat, or it is sometimes sold for pet food or bird food or whatever. But all of it is used.
Wonderful. Alrighty, let's taste.
Should we get going? So
Okay.
you will all have noticed that you've got 4 packs numbered 1 to 4. Number 1, you've got the most of. So we hope that you've taken advantage of having a little snack on that. You may have guessed that we won't give too much away. That's, if we're giving you the most, it's probably the one we're going to start with as well. But what we wanted to do, and in front of all of your guides, you should have this 1 A4 sheet that's effectively like you would do for wine, kind of a systematic approach, if you like, to tasting the ham. And one of the reasons for doing it is, rather than just diving in, let's take a step back, let's have a think about what we're going to do. So all of these things that James has been saying about, maybe we can start to think about them, appreciate the thing, especially when we move on to the more expensive ones, because we're going to taste them rather than just scoff them.
And if you do this on a regular basis, even mentally rather than physically writing down, you can begin to discover what kind of ham you like, what are good characteristics or characteristics that appeal to you. And therefore, you can begin to build up your knowledge and make more informed choices about, when you come to buy various kinds of ham.
So the first thing we like to do is obviously the appearance, just as you would if you're looking at your glass, see what you think about it. So light pink, nothing sort of too out of the ordinary, James, would you say?
No, there's a decent amount of fat running within the muscle, which is a good sign because that's going to give you, again, it will lubricate the lean meat as it goes down, making for a more enjoyable, tastier bit of ham.
It's good to think as well about what the fat's doing. So if you put some ham on the back of your hand, just think about or notice what the fat does as it warms up. So this one, I mean, is going pretty translucent, and that's partly so our master carver in Borough prepared these packs if people are wondering how they're carved so well. Then, drop it in. Then, full screen. Then you get an idea what the fat's doing. And then you can see on this sheet as well, we talk about crystals of tyrosine. So these, I can see one in ours. You may notice in your packs, there might be small white crystals. They look like coarse sea salt, really. And a lot of people mistake it for salt. But actually what it is, it's the amino acid tyrosine. So as the ham is hanging, losing weight, the moisture is evaporating, the amino acids can't go with the vapor, with the moisture, and they stay behind and they form these crystals.
No, they're exactly the same things you'll find in Parmesan. Chemically, it's identical, those crunchy crystals that you'll find in Parmesan. One of the things also just to be aware of is, and this will be the case with all the hams, is that your piece may look different. It depends which part of the muscle it's been carved from. This is from a muscle called the mather. It's the biggest, the most productive part of the ham. But you may have got a sort of smaller piece of that sort of shape. It's not different. It just simply comes from a different muscle on the ham. All of the hams come from the same ham, so we should have similar characteristics, but you may find that they look slightly different from the ones we are tasting. So we've looked at it, we've inspected how much fat there is infiltrating the muscle, how translucent the fat gets. Give it a good smell, see what you can pick up off that. I mean, this is, for me, it's quite a simple porky flavor, slightly almost notes of cooked pork. And that's a little sort of hint of sweetness. But it's not the most complex of aromas.
We should get it eaten. There you go.
So, give it a good chew. And I think what this is a good quality Serrano ham.
Well, best to tell them which is which.
It's a fine quality ham. It's a little bit on the salty side, I'd say. It's on the saltier end of the spectrum, but it's got a nice, gentle sort of underlying sweetness there too, and decent amount of fat, so you get a nice mouthfeel, and you get that nice, rich flavour in your mouth. Texture's decent. Again, from the muscle that we've just had, the mather, you can be a little pasty. It's generally the moistest, the muscle that contains most moisture because it is the largest muscle. So you get this juiciness from it.
And how the fat melts in your mouth is worth consideration, I always think. So what we'll possibly experience with the other hams is how much the fat contributes to the way that the taste fills your mouth. We should move on because we should get a shift on.
Indeed. Well, and then clear your palate with a sip of that lovely En Rama sherry, and we will move on to the next ham. What we're going to do at the end is tell you what the hams were, their ages, their provenance, that kind of thing. But now it's a case of you discovering the differences between the various kinds of ham.
And you'll be surprised to know we're doing ham number 2. So just in case.
Ham number 2. So immediately, if one is just looking at the slice of ham, it is a darker red than the previous example, which is suggestive perhaps of a different breed of animal. It's got a good amount of fat, both interleaving and external. It's got a much more complex aroma. Slightly cooked notes on that again, and a little bit of mushroom, of that sort of slightly fungal smell, which is an intrinsic part of the overall flavor profile. So we try that one, and I think immediately you can tell you've got a more intense flavor here. It's richer. It's the salt, I think, is in better balance. That can vary from ham to ham, but I think that one's got a nice balance of salt and sweet notes. The fat is quite rich, a little bit buttery,
and the flesh is more complex. It's got that complexity that suggests it's probably been aging longer. I would say.
Yeah.
I really like it from every time.
Yeah, and the aftertaste, I think you'll notice, is much more lingering. It remains in the mouth, still giving you that intense sweet salt flavor with those cooked notes with that one, very definitely. But yeah, you can tell initially it's more immediate in the mouth. It's got a longer aftertaste and a rather sweeter flavor to it.
Number three.
Number three. Again, another sip of the sherry. The reason dry sherry is so good with Iberico ham is extremely rich, and the Fino just comes along and cleanses the palate afterwards, allowing you to start trying a different ham without the sort of aftertaste which can otherwise linger for literally for minutes in the mouth.
I'd really encourage people, if you didn't do it so far, get this one on your back of your hand or wherever you want, really, just to bring it up to more body temperature and just see what you think of the fat. So you'll notice in our appearance section on the tasting guide, we talk about shininess of the fat. And for me, especially if you just come back to your second pack, and especially with your first pack, it's just brilliant in terms of. I'm getting a bit weird.
No, I mean, I've put this on my hand and it is melting. So that suggests something about the content of the fat. It's a big clue as to what kind of ham it may be. It's, if you just hold it in your fingers, it will turn to liquid. It's a wonderful moisturizer. Spend a day carving ham, you will end up with lovely soft hands, even if a slightly piggy smell. So that's a much sweeter aroma to me. With sort of hints of almost a sort of slight cheesiness to me.
It's like
in the
cheddar rind almost, like cloth. You know that the cloth on it.
Yeah. Which again, it's probably connected a little bit with the molds that develop on the ham, on the outside of the ham during the curing process. So. You put that in, and with that fat melting like that, you get a really intense flavor. I'm getting a very some notes of dried fig from that one, actually, quite fruity.
Fruity. You're much better at picking out what it is than I am. I'll go with fruity.
Probably. I was going to say less savoury, but the savouriness, the salt comes through at the end. But initially, I said I get a sort of sweet fruitiness from it.
But also it's worth a mention. So everybody's pack will likely look slightly different. Because like James said, we send a whole ham or 4 whole hams up to borough, or in this instance, 2 8 whole hams up to borough, they carve the patch for us and send them back. So they don't just do them from one section. So one of the other things that you will experience if you ever buy your whole ham, you can taste the different areas.
And the different characteristics texturally as well as flavour-wise. I really like that. It's intense. It's got this lovely sort of sweet fruitiness, followed by the savoury notes, and then a long finish. If you didn't drink anything, this would be a flavour that would carry around in your mouth for 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. Its intensity is remarkable, and generally will have come is evidence of a long curing period.
We better do 4 and then let everyone have the get back.
Yeah. So number 4. We've got a nice fatty bit of ham. I mean, people recommend ideally maybe about 15% fat per lean on a slice of ham. I personally think you can go up to nearly 50% and it's still absolutely lovely. The fat is the secret of this whole thing. And very different, that one.
We've skipped straight. We were going to do the appearance. We do need to get a new one.
I know, I do apologise. But that one has a much softer start. And partly the quantity of fat, it's got a lovely creaminess to it. That one you can kind of almost taste, one feels the herbs, the grasses and herbs that they're consuming with the acorns. It's quite a sort of earthy feel to it. One of the things about the aromas of hams, in particular long cured hams, is that they contain quite a lot of notes that in isolation might be quite unpleasant. You get sort of animal barnyard notes, you get notes of rancidity, but it's about the ratio to create that overall melody, harmony of flavors that the best Iberico hams have. But on occasion, you will get ones which are noticeably rancid or noticeably barnyardy or whatever. And that's really a sign that they're slightly out of proportion, but not of itself necessarily false. And certain parts of the ham will show it more clearly than others.
It's surprising this one for me was a lot less salty. Normally I'd expect this one to have that hit of salt, but I don't know, I think it might be the 3rd cut. Shall we come back to Tim and see if there's questions?
Yes.
So yeah, certainly a few questions, but yeah, I think before we reveal it, Tim Sykes, I know you're tasting along. Do you want to maybe just share your thoughts on the hams and how they've worked with the sherry?
Yes, absolutely. Very happy to. Well, wonderful presentation. Fascinating. I have to say I knew nothing about proper Jamón Ibérico. For me, I have 2 favourites amongst the 4, which are the 2nd one and the 4th one, for different reasons. But I'm actually tasting with 2 different sherries. So I've got the delicious En Rama, which we've talked about earlier, but I've also got a Palo Cortado. Happen to have handy, which is the Cayetano del Pino Solera, which many members will know is one of my favourite sherries. I think in terms of matching the Jamón and the sherry, I think for sherries 1 and 2 probably, so the ones that tend to have a bit less fat and are maybe a bit saltier, I think the Palo Cortado probably goes better. It's got a very slightly more sweetness to it, but only very slightly. So if we're going to get Anaraki, the En Rama Fino is about 1 gram per litre of sugar. So it's very, very dry, it's bone dry. Whereas the Palo Cortado is just under 3 grams per litre sugar. And I think a little bit of sweetness with all that saltiness is quite important. So I think as you go up the scale, the quality of the ham, the Tio Pepe En Rama gets better. So I think for the number 4, for me, the perfect match is the Tio Pepe without a doubt. But I think for the number 1, I would err towards the Palo Cortado.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and yeah, goes with what we tend to feel. I mean, I don't know. Normally at this point, we ask the people to vote for what their favourite is. It may be a bit difficult to sort of collate 300, 200 responses. It's always interesting to know what people like before you tell them what they actually are. I don't know if people want to just, you know.
We can set up a poll very quickly. So yeah, let's see if we can do that
You still want
very
to
quickly.
do a carving demo? We're ready to do it if you want. I'm aware it's 8:15. I can do it in 15 minutes.
We might just get a few more questions, and then for those that want to stay on a little bit later and watch the carving, we might finish with the carving at the end, just to do that. But let me see then, we've got lots of questions. Are any nitrates ever added to the ham, or is this banned?
Nitrates are added to the hams. Most producers do use them. They have a very bad, they've developed a bit of a bad name, but I think from what I gather, the evidence of their carcinogenic properties is, you know, you've got to consume an awful lot for it to become a risk. And the risk of poisoning, food poisoning, I would say is not worth taking simply, you know, to say it's pure and clean. I think it's a chemical that's been used for thousands of years, well, hundreds of years. And, you know, it has saved genuinely probably tens of thousands of lives. So I'm not going to argue against nitrates.
Sure. Another question we had was, how old are the pigs at culling?
Minimum age for a Bayota animal is 14 months. Some will be up to 18, 20 months at slaughter. So again, it makes quite a difference to the finished product, that age, the developing flavour that you get from older animals.
Wonderful. And is there any difference between which leg the pig sleeps on?
I don't know if anybody monitors which one it even sleeps on. There's an interesting thing when you carve a ham. If you imagine where the hip bone is, when you carve it, it's on one or the other side when you start it, depending on which side of the ham you're on. So if you're, I can't ever remember which way around it is, but effectively you have to go backhand on the hip bone. But for example, in carving competitions, they label hams left and right and toss a coin. In Spain, they do carving competitions. We did one a couple of years ago, actually. And obviously how you prefer to carve, where the hip bone appears, can affect how well you carve.
But
that's the only time I think a left side ever makes it.
I think the flavour thing is apocryphal.
Sure. So we've got the poll ready, so we're going to put that up. So if everyone could vote, those that had the packs, which was there.
We did have a question, I know, I think you mentioned it actually, somebody had asked earlier, which was about the production regions of Iberico ham. You should each have a guide in front of you, I would hope. And there will be a page which has the 4 production regions, but it's not entirely clear on the map of Spain, which it is. So broadly, it is about the sort of central 2/3 of the map really is what makes up this. So in the north, you've got Guijuelo, which is the oldest DOP. It's at the highest altitude, the slowest curing.
Do you want to put that in?
Yeah, I guess. Oh, what's happened?
keep talking and I'll do this smoothly.
So you have Guijuelo in the north, which is actually in Castilla Leon. Going south, directly south, you have the province, the region of Extremadura, which is borders with Portugal.
So should we share the screen?
No, let's just
talk.
Okay. So you have Extremadura running along the Portuguese border, and below that, in the west, you have Huelva, the province of Huelva, which is where the hams, Jabugo hams, come from. And then over to the east, you have the province of Córdoba, which is where the Pedroches hams come from. 4 DOPs, Guijuelo is the oldest, then Jabugo, then Extremadura, then Pedroches. And Extremadura and Pedroches have got the most strict rules for the DOP about them being animals that have been raised, slaughtered, cured within the region. So, sorry, that was somebody had asked that, I know, earlier.
And we promised we would answer on email.
Yeah,
there you go.
Not a problem. So we'll launch the poll now, and if everyone could vote for their favourite ham out of 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then we will reveal which ham is which. Whilst those votes are coming in, just one more question. How long will a whole ham keep once it's been once it's begun to be carved?
A purist would probably say a week. A realist would probably say a couple of months. It shouldn't rot, it shouldn't go off, but it will dry, become harder, chewier, less enjoyable to eat.
Well, our demo ham's been open since January.
Yeah.
And you'll see when I carve it, just why it says 6 to 8 weeks is probably as long as you want to keep it. We still eat it afterwards, but
yeah, I mean, it's difficult, particularly if you're a family, you buy an acorn fed ham, it is unlikely that you will get through it in a week. So, you know, rationally, as I said, 6 to 8 weeks is probably okay, but keep it in a dry conditions. Possibly something like your kitchen, if it's not too hot, because obviously the hotter it is, the faster it will dehydrate.
And then the same question to you, Tim, with the sherries, once they've been opened, how quickly do they need to be consumed?
I would say for the En Rama, if you've got a half bottle, drink it over a couple of nights, maybe 3 nights, which is not too onerous, I would think, for most people. Full bottle, yeah, probably a week and a half. I wouldn't keep it a lot longer than that. For the palo cortado, 2 or 3 weeks, no problem, probably more, actually, a month, without any problem at all.
Wonderful. So, James, should we show the results, or do you want to?
Well, let's announce what the various hams were. So, James, number 1.
Ham number 1 is a Serrano ham, as James R already let slip, from the province of Teruel, just to the west of Valencia, higher, really high up, because you tend to use the coolness, you know, of the mountains to help cure the ham, etc. Really nice, balanced ham. Teruel is actually quite strict in its DOP.
Could you just explain what Serrano ham actually refers to?
Serrano ham is any ham made from the meat of white pigs. It means, Serrano means mountain ham, so it's a ham that can be made anywhere around Spain. In fact, Teruel shouldn't be called Serrano because it has a DOP, therefore a specific provenance. But it is simpler to think of it as a Serrano ham from a white pig. And this one has been cured for a minimum of 18 months, which is a long time for a white pig ham. And hence it has more depth, more complexity than the majority of Serrano hams you'll find. So that was number 1.
Do you want to do number 2?
Number 2 is a jamón de cebo de campo, so a free-range but grain-fattened ham from a company called Jamón in the province of Huelva, in a small town called Corte Concepcion. Small producer family, they only make a few hundred hams a year. Many of the big boys are making thousands, tens of thousands. A really good, I think Cebo de Campo is a really good entry-level Iberico ham. A well-made ham with one of these free-range animals can be an excellent, good value way of discovering Iberico ham.
Number 3.
Number 3. This is where we were a bit naughty. This is actually pata negra. So this is jamón de bellota, 100% Iberico, purebred, acorn fattened ham, which comes from Extremadura, specifically from just outside the town of Badajoz. It's produced by a company called Señoría de Montanera. What's great about them is that they control the whole process. They breed the animals, they have the farms on which the animals are raised, they own the dehesa on which they fatten, their own slaughterhouse, their own curing houses. So they're controlling the whole process, and therefore you know exactly what's going on. Really good ham, very good producer.
I'll do number 4.
And James will do number 4.
We'll stop taking them in turns. And then number 4. So we played it a bit tricky. So what we thought we'd do is throw a spanner in the works. And number 4 is still a bellota fattened animal, but from a mixed breed pig. So 75% Iberico. So mother 100% Iberico, father 50-50, Duroc Iberico. And they do this, as James will have said, for a variety of reasons: size of the leg, number of piglets that you get, hardiness of the piglets, and also infiltration of fat. The Duroc tends to get the veining, whereas an Iberico tends to get a thick seam of fat through the muscle. And actually, I really, really like Castro Gonzalez hams. Did we say who it's from?
No.
Oh, sorry. So Castro Gonzalez, family-run company, 3rd generation now.
Based in Guijuelo. So this is from the furthest north of the production areas. And I felt with this ham, you could taste that from the kind of soft sweetness of it, long cured with minimum salt. Traditionally, Andalusian hams were more savory because of the hotter climate. They would spend an extra day in the salt. And therefore you got the sweeter ones in the north, more intensely savory in the south. So what was the result of the poll?
We'll put that up now. So our members do obviously have fine taste and could pick out the provenance of the pig.
But I think one of the things that's interesting, and again, it's why we always try and get people to vote before they know what the hams are. People have a tendency, I'm sure you get in the wine business as well, to choose, as it were, the most expensive and presume that it is the one that will suit them most, the best. And in the end, it's about tasting. It's about what appeals to you. And if you go to a reputable ham shop and ask for a taste, if they don't give it to you, I would suggest you walk out. Because if they are selling good hams, they should be very happy to give you a taste of it and let you make the decision as to which of the hams you want to buy.
What was your favourite this evening, James?
My favourite was, I think actually was number 4. There was a soft, creamy, mild but intense, and that's the wonderful thing that you can get from Iberico.
As you say, everyone does have different experiences with the hams, and whether you like the saltiness of the second ham. I think it's, as we see with wine, it really is a subjective, taste is subjective, and what one person likes is very much dictated by their own experiences, DNA as well. But Tim, did you have a favorite?
Yes, it was number 4 followed by number 2. I think they're all fabulous, I have to say. I had a couple of comments that I wanted to share. First of all, every time I go to Spain, I have jamón, and I've never actually done what I do with a glass of sherry or any wine. I always sniff a glass of sherry or a glass of wine before drinking it, and I don't do that with jamón. And actually, sticking it under your nose makes such a huge difference to get all the aroma from the ham on. So that was the first thing I wanted to mention. The other thing I wanted to mention was you talked about the processes, James, of making the wine, the secadero process, and opening up the shutters. And that is exactly the same in sherry country. So if you go into a bodega in sherry country, they have these huge, great shutters that they open, and you get two winds in sherry country, the poniente and the levante. And depending which direction the wind is flowing from, it has an impact on the taste of the sherry. So it's exactly the same. It's a fascinating parallel.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, you know, we've mentioned Serrano as a generic term for mountain ham, but mountain is the crucial thing because that's where you get wind. And wind is a hugely important part, particularly in the majority of human existence, which was before we had the ability to control our environment's atmosphere, humidity, temperature, whatever. So you wanted to make your ham on a mountain because these winds would help with the drying process.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just to confirm, we've had a couple of questions. In the follow-up email, we will include details of each of the hams, including prices. So yeah, don't feel like you needed to have written down everything that was just said. We will send that out in the email tomorrow.
No, there are 4 on the bone hams available on our website. So they're quite easy to find.
So we did promise that we'd do a little bit of a carving demonstration, but just before we do that, just in case some people do have to run off at the scheduled finish time of 8:30. Tim, just one final sherry question to finish on. With the barrels that are used in the Solera system, do you know what wood they are used, what they are made from, and then how long they are used within the Solera system? And then we often hear about sherry cask-aged whiskies. Is that still common?
So the butts, as they're called, are made of oak. They last a very long time. They can be used for many, many years, and most of the bodegas have coopers who can repair the casks. I mean, what is fascinating is that up until I think it is the 70s or thereabouts, sherry was exported to the UK in butt, and therefore when they arrived and were bottled, and the Wine Society used to bottle our own sherries, the casks were then trucked up to Scotland for the whiskey trade, so for aging whiskey. Now that doesn't happen. All sherry has to come in bottle from the region of production. So what happens, and this is a very lucrative part of the sherry business because sherry's been on its uppers for many years and has been struggling to survive. In the bodegas, they actually put inexpensive sherry into brand new barrels in order to age the barrels and to season the barrels, and then they empty the cheap sherry out of the barrels and they send them off to Scotland. So they are still supplying sherry casks to Scotland, but they're not doing it via the UK. Oh, they're not doing it via the UK bottlers because they can't bottle. They're actually doing it direct up to Scotland. And that has been partially responsible for shoring up the very precarious sherry industry over the last few years.
And then speaking of bottling, a couple of members have noted that the date of bottling of the En Rama is actually printed on the bottle. Is that limited to just En Rama, or are we seeing that?
No, I wish that more sherries did that. Some companies print, and I'm very delighted that Gonzalez Bias does that. They print the bottling date on the back label. Other sherry houses have these rather opaque bottling codes, and you can't figure out when a wine was bottled. The point is that particularly for Fino and En Rama, the younger the bottling, the better. So if you have a bottling of Fino that's 3 years old, the wine is not going to be fresh. You need to find a bottling that is as fresh as possible. So the Wine Society's Fino, our own label Fino, every time we place an order, it's a new bottling. So you can guarantee Getting very, very fresh sherry.
So like the James has mentioned, if you see a price that's too good to be true, it may be that it's an
old
bottle that's been left on the shelves for quite a while. So thank you everyone for your time. As I said, we will carry on with a carving demonstration for those that are able to stick around. As I said, also we'll follow up with information on the hams and a little bit more on the sherry in the follow-up email. So please do continue to submit any questions. But yeah, James, are you ready to
I'll just pause while I get everything up, if there's other sherry chat.
Okay, yeah, you do that, and Tim and I will carry on talking. Still got plenty of sherry questions. What is the next sherry question? Speaking of that. Yeah, Tim, with global warming, climate change, we obviously always get that with every region we go to. But Jerez is a very warm climate. So how are they adapting to climate change?
Well, I don't think it's a major problem, interestingly, in the Jerez region, and I think I'm right in saying anyway. Generally, the sherry that's made that goes into cask, the young wine from Palomino, generally it's relatively neutral and not particularly, it has very little character, and if it's picked early enough, I think it's fine for sherry production. So I think, unlike a lot of regions of Spain and Western Europe in general, I don't think global warming is particularly a problem. I think what potentially is more of a problem is the rather unpredictability of the weather, rather than the heat per se. So I think, I mean, we've seen in France this year, even in Provence, there are frosts, and you get hail and that kind of thing. And I think maybe to a lesser extent in the south of Spain, but my perception, and I may be completely wrong, is that it's less of an issue than in other parts of temperate Europe.
Sure. And then the classic question of why is sherry so cheap? And we always hear about the revival of sherry, and this is the year that sherry is making a comeback. But what is your view of the future of sherry?
Well, in terms of value for money, sherry is off the scale. I can't think of a better value category at all. I mean, to have a sherry that's, or a wine that's 5, 6, 7 years old and is under £10, and is so brilliant for kind of food matching and that kind of thing, it staggers me that the wines are still such great value. Sherry is, the vineyard plantings in the region have gone down massively since the heyday of the 70s. And that's a good thing and a bad thing, because some of the less good vineyards have been eradicated. So the quality of sherry has never been better, because now the remaining vineyards are only really the best vineyards. But until the last 18 months, our sherry sales were slowly declining. Since lockdown, they've gone absolutely exponentially upwards. And I'm hoping that we will be able to maintain that. And my job as a buyer at the Wine Society is to really encourage people to discover sherry, because I think it's a wonderful, wonderful drink. And I think it's interesting. There's almost a divide. You get the older consumer of sherry who, generally has been brought up on sherry for many, many years. But then there's now a trendy young generation of sherry drinkers coming through who love to go to tapas bars and that kind of thing, and really understand the wonders of Spanish cuisine. And so you're seeing a revival in the younger generation. And part of my task is to try and persuade that middle ground of people who weren't brought up on sherry and don't go to tapas bars and that kind of thing, how wonderful sherry is.
I think that's maybe why we have seen such a surge, is because it is so good with food that it's often actually seen as an on-premise drink, and without being able to go out to restaurants. And over some people were starting to try it at home, and hopefully have caught the bug. We're just going to bring up a slide which briefly shows the versatility of sherry and food matching, because it really does. It is a wine style, and obviously there are various styles that can cover the whole gambit of food and wine matching. So again, we'll share this with members in the follow-up email, because I think it does show. But Tim, any particular favourites of yours amongst
Well, I mean, I think I mentioned fish and chips and sushi with Fino and Manzanilla. I did hear a friend of mine who lives in Jerez and who supplies the Wine Society with quite a lot of our wines, has a great little adage, which is, I better get this right. He said, if it swims, you have to drink Manzanilla or Fino. If it flies, it's Amontillado. And if it runs, it's Oloroso.
A lovely summary there. So as I said, we'll include that, and then I think it's, hopefully we'll give some members some food for thought to explore some food and wine pairings. But James, are you ready to do a bit of carving?
Ready. And with the wonders of technology, we have a second camera, which my colleague will now go to advanced and click content from second camera, bottom left, and click share. Wonders of technology.
Wonderful.
So we'll be quick, but essentially, obviously we've tried the ham. If you want to have a go, or if you've had a go and unsure what may or may not have been possible to do better, hopefully we can run through some of that now. So what we're going to do here is show you on the thing itself the areas that James had talked about. We're going to show you the tools that you need to cut effectively, and then we're going to show you how to use your knives to get the best results. And oh no, actually, I'll do it in a second. I've managed to, would you mind, there's a plate on that table. Sorry, I went and got a plate and then left it. So first things first, let's talk about the ham itself. So pata negra means black foot, and we can see that our ham here happens to have black toenails. Now it's important to remember what James said about pata negra only being legally applicable to a ham that is 100% Iberico de bellota, so free range and gone through the Montanera process of fattening on grass and acorns. The Duroc pig that we cross the pigs with also has a black hoof, but there are Iberico subbreeds that don't have a black hoof. It's extremely rare to find an Iberico ham without a black hoof, just because we as customers know black hoof, Iberico ham, we know what's what. So James also mentioned about the black plastic tag that's on the ankle. And you'll notice this one actually has two. And that's because what we've got here is a ham from the protected denomination of origin of Pedroches. So ham number 2 was from Haburgo, ham number 3 from Extremadura, and now ham number 4, which unfortunately you can't taste tonight, from Pedroches, so from our 4th Iberico area. One of the things with the breed, incredibly slim ankle. It's a curiosity of it, and something that's really noticeable if you were to compare a mixed breed pig and a pure breed pig back to back, I think.
Or hock to hock.
Or hock to hock. Then the next thing we have that's hidden by this enormous logo is an area called the Corvejon. We're going to get rid of this anyway. But the Corvejon is important. It's a protrusion here because we're going to use it to help us work out where to make our initial cut to start opening the ham. So you can see as I run my finger, there's a big drop just there. Then we have the area known as the jarrete, or the hock. And this is the most fibrous area. One thing that's interesting, this ham shows it quite well. You can see effectively a V here, and that's where they've left the skin. So here was fat, Here they've left the skin, and it's really a stylistic thing. But also what it means is that the salt penetrates through differently. So up in here, as well as being very fibrous, as you'd expect, you know, shin of beef, anything from this end of an animal that does all that work needs long, slow cooking because of all the connective tissue. But you can also hear, so really tough, sort of leathery, much softer. And the salt doesn't infiltrate as much. So a lot of connoisseurs, that's their favorite bit. Then we have the matha, really the money muscle. It literally translates to cushion, I think. You see it written as cushion quite a lot, but I prefer to just use the terminology. And that hip bone that we talked about before is about here. So the matha is from here to here, and then we come into what's known as the punta, or the point. And what's really, for me personally, the punta is my favorite part. And that's because, as we know from James's presentation and from putting the ham on our hand from the Beyota grade, that the fat's actually pretty much liquid at room temperature. And that means that the fat's running through the ham as it's hanging. So it hangs from a rope this end and collects in the punta. And that's why you see those kind of umbrellas in the bars, because let me tell you the amount of shirts I've ruined on the inner sleeve. The fat stains like anything. So then if we spin the ham around, and this is where this style of ham stand really comes into its own. It's a bit more expensive, but if you're going to spend Beyota money, I would recommend a stand that lets you spin, and maybe not one that has a screw here that penetrates the ham, because any cut or incision that you make in the ham, you start letting air in, you start drying it out. You don't really run the risk of mold, but certainly you start running it out. And on this ham, we have a secondary tag because it's protected denomination of origin, DOP, Los Pedroches. And we can see that this, try not to cover our marketing manager's webcam in ham fat from the 2017 season. So we're dealing with a ham that's 4 years old. Most hams won't have this extra tag. So in here, jarrete again, then we're into the babilla. And then there's another area that you would deal with at home that will be in your booklet. That's the third cut that would do like this. But let's get on with opening the ham. And really, get an apron, keep some kitchen paper next to you because these guys are greasy. So first thing I'm going to do is this tag, but I would suggest always that you keep this, because in the very unlikely event that the ham has an issue, you need the batch and best before, or the supplier needs the batch and best before to help you sort it out. So the first thing we're going to need is something to open the ham. At a minimum, you're going to need 2 knives when you're carving your ham. A carving knife, which is always going to be long and flexible, but how long it is could vary. So I actually have 2 carving knives in my roll when I carve, but I'm a bit over the top. This one's a bit more rigid. This one's a bit more flexible, but really you only need 1. And then you need a knife, a paring knife's fine, a vegetable knife. This is an actual boning knife, but you need something that you're going to do the dirty work with. You don't want to use your carving knife to do your prep effectively. So other options for opening the ham would be, this is a butcher's knife. You see the handle extends past the blade, but you could use any kitchen knife, bread knife, anything. But let's say we're going to use our boning knife. You remember the corvejón? You can see it now. It's really a big protrusion. 2 fingers, 3 if you've got skinny, 1 if you've got enormous. And then a 45-degree angle. Knife in. If your knife's really sharp, you just spin it round till you hit the bone. But if you didn't want to do that, if your knife isn't so sharp or you're not so sure, you can use your chef's knife, or actually you can use a bread knife and just saw your way through. If you're going to use a chef's knife, you can just rock. And you do that till you hit the bone. And you see, you need something strong, rigid. The next thing's obviously getting rid of this tough outer skin. And we're going to come from back here. But we're not going to come in because we'll lose a load of meat. Let's just do a nice, easy cut.
So essentially you're following the contours of the ham.
I am. And you'll get rid of a nice piece. And it's good to do it little by little. So you'll see on this first piece, here, you can see that that's the sort of colour that I want. This yellow fat is no good. So when we carve at events or we carve in store to help our wholesale customers, you say that, you get people coming up to you and say, oh, don't throw out the fat's the best bit. And you know, they're right, the fat is the important bit. That's where all the flavour comes from. But it's the white, the pink fat that we want, not the yellow fat. The yellow fat's done its job. It's looked after the meat during that long curing time.
And essentially it is heavily oxidized. It is deeply rancid. It may have had flies, mosquitoes, whatever. Its job was to protect, not to be eaten. And it spoils the ham if the person carving it doesn't remove that from the slice.
So here we've come to our first bit. So we can just take a slice off, give it to our quality control to make sure. And just in case you're worrying that I'm going to make you watch me carve a whole ham, I'm not, don't worry. I have one that I prepared earlier.
I'm sorry you don't have the opportunity to try it because that is
Exceptional.
seriously intense and that fat is so nutty.
And those first few slices can be a tiny bit rancid, but that flavour is exceptional. So here, as you've probably gathered, is a ham that we've been carving for staff, for demos, and none of it goes to waste, don't worry. But if you remember, I was talking about the ham carving knife. When it comes time to carve our slices, we're not going to carve like we're sawing wood or cutting a loaf of bread. What we're going to do is cut in one direction. And by that I mean, if you imagine the knife moving through the ham, knife goes in, carve back towards me, knife comes out, back to the starting point, knife goes in, carves out, and that gives us an even finish. So if you were to look at this, it's hard to tell, but it's not bumpy and all over the place. So it's, knife goes in, this ham is really dried out, carve through, let it out, carve through. And then when it comes time to finish the slice, I don't tilt the knife, I do a sudden pop and get the knife out. That pop will take a few goes and it's quite annoying till you get the hang. But then once you do get the hang, I don't know what you'll do. Open your own sherry bar. Knife goes in.
And there are two reasons really you want to carve flat like this. One is aesthetic, particularly if you're doing it commercially. If it's flat, you know that the person who's carving it knows what they're doing. But also it's the minimum surface area, because that surface area is going to go dry, potentially get rancid from oxygen. So the least possible area exposed is the flattest surface. So you're reducing wastage and creating something that looks much more appealing and attractive.
And when you see somebody going quicker, it looks like they're doing that, but I'm not. I'm only carving in one direction, but letting the knife in and out a lot slower. So let's find a nice bit. So in, let the knife out, carve, let the knife out, carve, and then that's enough for a slice. If you imagine the size of the inside of your mouth, pop, get your slice off.
And you're carving thin.
Yeah, not excessively thin, and you won't get it here because we're using these jazzy camera lights, but you should see the knife through it.
Mm-hmm.
If we were backlit, you'd just, yeah, you see the knife quite easily. And then one of the big things with carving a ham is what you do when you get to the hip bone. So what we often see is a big U shape in hams. And that's a problem for two things. One is that you're slowly but surely not going with the way that the meat lies. You're going against the grain. The other is that from here to here, you've got yield. And the third and most important is that it makes you look like you don't know what you're doing when your mates come round, which is a terrible shame. So this is where your boning, your paring, your veg knife, whatever you've got comes back in handy. And what you're going to do as soon as you start hitting that bone, so that would have appeared, there'd only be sort of that much meat on top of the hip bone. It comes out really early on. Get it like you're going to really, do some damage. And just little by little, guide the tip of the knife around the ham. So if down here, I've done this a few times on this very ham, but you see the flex that I'm using in the knife that lets me get the tip in against the bone? Tiny, you see how little that moves in, like that. And then using my other finger, guide it round.
So essentially you're releasing the muscle from the bone.
But what we don't want to do is stab down, because, oh, that's not a very good angle, like the Blair Witch Project of ham. This bone isn't flat. So if you were to come down straight, you see how the knife ends up, that's touching the ham now, and all of that meat in there would have gone to waste. So what we do once we've marked what we call, in Spanish they say marcar el hueso, so like marking the bone, guiding the bone, is up to the bone, and then use the length of the knife to free the slice. And if you're doing it live, you don't quite free it, so you've just got to tease it off.
I have to say, I'm not as good a carver as James, but I can carve a ham. It was the single most useful tip, I think, that I picked up, because it's what stops that curve happening, because you can keep it flat, because you can carve right up to the bone without feeling you have to sort of take the knife up above it.
And then as you come around the bone, use the flexibility of the knife to force a flat surface on the knife itself. So you see, I'm being a bit dramatic, but what I'm doing by using this bend is forcing the pressure down to where I want it. So what I'm going to do is, with the same coming out, coming back in, I'm just going to come around the bone. And then the same deal all the way through, and it's separated. And it's one of those things where, without wishing to sound like I'm blowing my own trumpet too much, it's not as easy as it looks, but once you've done it a couple of dozen times, you'll feel it in your wrist and you'll suddenly have it. So we'll spin over to the other side, because there's one thing I want to show you. And this is what I was talking about with the hip bone. So that hip bone there was easy for me as a right-hander, because I just had to do that. For a left-hander, it would have been difficult. But pigs like equality when they're being cut up. So if you're a right-hander, the hip bone comes back to haunt you on this hand, because you get to here and you're straight in the bone. So what we do, same deal, with our boning knife, mark the bone. From up here, tiny bit at a time. I'm obviously a bit further down this ham, so I just scored into the bone. So I'm slicing away nice and happily. This side is way drier. The babilla naturally has a much lower covering of fat, or lesser fat covering, you might say. But what I'm going to have to do now is switch from carving like that to backhand. Keep my fingers out of the way. And I carve into the hip bone. And the same deal. I've marked it so my slice comes out. That was a bit of a ragged slice, so let's do a good one. And it comes away. And that is essentially how to carve a ham. So the key takeaway is your knife that you use to open the ham and score the bones is not the one you carve with. The knife that you carve with is definitely not the one that you use to open it, take the skin off, go around the bones. You don't carve like bread, in, then out. And keep your surfaces as flat as you can. You'll notice I've got a piece of old wood here just to get under the hip bone. That's just because I'm
Otherwise you're having to carve.
flash, yeah. But at home, that's perfectly fine. You make your life slightly more difficult. So I would be inclined even to get a mug. That's what I'd do at home. Just get a mug that brings it up. That would be my ideal height, because then I'm completely parallel to the floor. And that's that. A quick carving demo. If you did want actual carving tips or anything, I'm very happy if you want to email Tim, if that's all right. They can email us.
Or we do run a ham school up at Borough Market where you will get much of the same information, but also the opportunity for a hands-on carving lesson as well. They're going on a weekly basis, I think, all through June and July. Have a look on brindisa.com.
Bro. So we're only half an hour over time. So
Yeah.
Sorry, everyone. To the 140 that stuck it out, thanks very much.
We did practice, I swear, I promise members, but these things happen when you get in the flow of live events. A question, I don't know how many members would have the confidence to take that on now after seeing that, but do you sell whole hams yourself?
Absolutely, yeah. So, and it is one of those things that it's not, all right, you're not gonna make it, it might be a bit difficult, but there's, YouTube is such a leveler. So there's a guy, you don't even have to speak Spanish, but a guy, anytime I go to an event, this guy called Roberto Santalla, that's just an exceptional carver, that's got like a 20-piece YouTube video that I'll just go, oh yeah, babilla, and I'll have a watch, and it just, have a go. Like, what's the worst that can happen? You have thick slices of something delicious.
And in essence, it's a craft. The more you practice it, the more you do it, the better you will get. It doesn't require inherent skill, practice.
Yeah, you've got to like it. If you don't like it, it's laborious. And if I go and help in places at Christmas, and because I'm in sales normally, so I go and do a real day's work. My back's caning, my shoulder hurts, my wrist starts hurting, and it's, but yeah, I'm very delicate.
And just to give us a guide, a whole ham, like one of that size, obviously it depends on the different,
for good quality,
top end about 575, 595. For our Terrawell 18-month cured, it's around about 120, I think.
Yeah, and the Cebo de Campo somewhere in the two, so I think it's 250, 260, somewhere around there.
And are they particularly seasonal? Do they taste better at Christmas time or?
No. What tends to happen is the lighter hams come out first because they need less curing. So what you tend to find is, when do they start coming out? February, don't they? New season, February, March. So you'll get sort of 7 kilos from 3 years ago. Then into the warmer months, you get 8.5. Then by September, you're into the 10s.
Which is slightly frustrating, since it's actually at Christmas that one would like to be selling the 6.5, 7 kilo hams whole, instead of which one's got 10 kilo monsters that, become very expensive.
Yes, but a 10 kilo ham, maybe what, 1 week in my household over Christmas.
And obviously the bones, the bones. So when you're finished, because otherwise I've brought this all the way up from the fridge for no reason. So when you're finished, you've got something like this. And one of the things to point out as a last tip is that there's this little bone that sits in here. And you could, oh, you can't see. But there's a little bone in there that you can break out and you get way more meat. But your bone should look something like this. And what you want to do, split down the middle, get rid of the hip because it will be rancid, stick a boning knife in there and break the hoof on a table and then make stock with the bones. But make sure it's a solid table because I put a hoof through a plastic table in Birkin doing an event on a tablecloth. Good luck.
Waste nothing. An awful lot of work went into producing that ham. Make the most of every last bit.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that rang through your presentation is just how important the provenance is and the care and skill that goes into rearing the hams. Is very similar to the
history. You know,
exactly.
It's been done for a long time.
And it's something that I think is very similar to the wines that we have from around the world. It's that care, and that I think consumers are starting to understand the importance of provenance and are looking to know what they're having.
It's
So
not about between price, quality comes in.
Absolutely. So hopefully tonight, members have found tonight as fascinating as I have. Thank you both very much for your time, as well as to Tim Sykes. Unfortunately, I think he's had some technical issues and has dropped off.
We don't away.
But yeah, so certainly thank you both. Both Jameses very much for tonight. So pleased to see so many members stick out for the whole 2 hours. So really do appreciate the members joining us. And as I said, we'll follow up with an email with more details. So please do reply to that, and any questions, as James have said, they're happy to answer them, and we're the same on the wine side. So a nice way to start the long weekend. Hopefully not too much, I doubt much sherry left over, and probably not much ham left over, but yeah, good way to kick off the long weekend.
Well, thank you very much indeed for
thanks for having us, and thanks to everyone for their attention. It's been brilliant.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much. Good night.
Good night.